I'm going to show you a very cool game played by Magnus Carlsen in one of the Title Tuesday tournaments on chess.com. And the reason I'm showing you this game is Magnus, we all know that he loves to play online with the shorter time controls, but he's also experimenting a lot with new openings, with creative ideas. And in this game, he's doing something I've never seen before. It's very strange opening with already a novelty on move 5. A lot of strange things are happening, but most of all, we are getting entertained with a lot of nice tactical ideas. So I'm going to show you the game. Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces against Uurtsaikh Agibileg from Mongolia. It's an international master, so let's say there's like 400 points rating difference. And Magnus, well, he starts the game with the move 1b4. It's called the Polish defense, the Sokolski opening, or most people, they love to call it also the Orangutan defense. It's not the most common move, it's a flank move. You're ignoring the center, but the idea is to grab some space on the queen side and you are about to fianchetto your queen's bishop. So there are various ways for black to deal with this move. The most common move here is to occupy the center with the move e5. But here Agibileg goes for the move d5. And after bishop b2, black continues developing with the move knight f6. White goes knight f3. So you see that white is having nice control over the dark squares already. e6 is played, so now black is attacking the pawn on b4. White protects the pawn with the move a3, and here black goes for the move bishop d6. And I think this looks like a very logical way of developing the pieces. Black is ready to castle kingside, and maybe at some point, if black does get a chance, he would love to prepare e5. Of course, e5 cannot be played right away. Other pieces need to support that square one more time. But before black gets a chance to complete its development, white played here a novelty, a very bizarre idea, an idea which we often see in other openings, but in this exact position, the move g4 has never been seen. So white is playing the first move b4 and then on the fifth move g4. So two flank pawn moves at the start of the game. And the idea is very clear. White would love to play g5 to attack the knight, opening up the diagonal so that the bishop gains in strength, hitting the pawn on g7. Well, here knight takes g4 was played, so black accepts the challenge. Now the pawn on g7 can be taken, but that's not what Magnus had in mind, because if you do take the pawn, there is rook g8 hitting the bishop. If bishop goes back, then black all of a sudden can play here the move e5. Black is taking over the initiative in the center. He has already developed two minor pieces. The rook is not doing badly on the g file at all. So don't take the pawn on g7 too early. A much more challenging move is the move rook to g1. It's one of the main ideas behind sacrificing your g-pawn. You're attacking the knight, and after the knight goes away, also the pawn on g7 can be taken. So there are various ways for black to continue here. Black decided to take the pawn on h2. That's an interesting move, but in hindsight, I believe that a move like e5 is even better, so that the bishop can be developed very soon as protecting the knight on g4. And well, there are a lot of lines which need to be checked. And well, objectively speaking, white is taking a lot of risk. Let me show you one line. If you attack the knight with the move h3, if the knight goes back, you get exactly what you want. You take on g7. However, apparently, according to the engines, black has a very strong move here with the move knight takes f2. You're opening up white's king. After king takes f2, there is the move e4. You're attacking the knight. And if the knight goes away, let's say the knight comes to d4, you're trying to save the knight as white, the queen comes out to h4, and things can go horribly wrong for white because it's a check. If the king goes away to e3, it's checkmate on f4. It's just one of the lines to show you how things can go horribly wrong. Well, instead, there are other ways of playing. White, for instance, doesn't have to play h3, but just to warn you that Magnus can maybe play in such a way, but it's not for us, you know. So just forget about the opening. Let's get entertained with what is happening here. Because after knight takes h2, the game's continuation, there followed knight takes, bishop takes h2, you're attacking the rook. And now, a very interesting moment, because the rook is under threat, and Magnus automatically took with the rook on g7. That's a very logical move, trying to reduce the material deficit. That's making a lot of sense, but much stronger here is rook g2. because you're getting a tempo, hitting the bishop on h2. Now if the bishop goes back, you do instead take with the bishop on g7, so you attack the rook on h8. After rook g8, there's a beautiful tactic. With bishop f6, you're attacking the queen, and you're opening up the g-file, so white is threatening to take the rook. After queen takes f6, rook takes g8 with check. Black got to solve the check, after which you can also do something about the threat of queen takes a1. So white is just an exchange up here. Let's go back to the game. Rook takes g7 played, and here, of course, the diagonal is kind of problematic. White is threatening to come back with the rook to g2 to attack both the bishop and the rook in the corner. Therefore, the move d4 was played. But a different way of stopping the threat is to play knight d7. Developing a piece is much more valuable than playing another time with your pawn. Because now after rook g2, white is having this double attack against the bishop and the rook. There's bishop e5 as the bishop is safe and the rook is no longer hanging. Anyway, back to the game. d4 played, and now the move e3 was played. So white is challenging the pawn on d4 immediately. But white is not only doing that, because if you do take the pawn on e3, white is not going to take back the pawn, but rather wants to play the move queen h5, attacking the bishop on h2, and you're threatening checkmate on f7. If you take the pawn on f2, you can do various things here. You can take the pawn, you can also just try to play it safe with your king. The king is safe there, and white is going to pick up a piece because black needs to solve the mating threat first. So the pawn on e3 cannot be taken. Black instead played here the move bishop e5 to protect the pawn one more time, to attack the rook on g7. And what is white going to play here? Well, very strange things are happening now, because both sides, they are not playing optimally. But don't forget, it's a blitz game. We are just trying to understand what the players are doing here. Queen g4 was played, so white is protecting the rook. Black can of course take that rook with the bishop. Bishop takes g7, queen takes g7. But after something like rook f8, you take the pawn on d4. And well, black does have some coordination problems, and white has very easy piece play here. Can take the pawn on h7. Maybe the bishop can at some point come to g7, and the material will be regained. And probably the rook on f8 can be won as well at some point. So after queen g4, there followed the move king f8. The rook is under threat. And what's the rook going to do? Well, Magnus's idea was to play here the move rook takes f7, which is the game's continuation. And interestingly, after the move bishop e5, if we go back 2 moves, instead of queen g4, rook takes f7 could have been played right away. It was more precise, because now after king takes f7, queen h5, you do get the same position as in the game. However, after starting with the move queen g4, black should have started here by ignoring the rook and continue developing with the knight to c6, supporting that pawn on d4. And black is in okay shape, because white cannot do that much. If you give a check, you trade off one pair of rooks, and the king is safe in the center. And well, the game continues, but white also is struggling with its own development. So well, let's go back. King f8 played in the game, and now we have this rook sacrifice. But it is actually not a full rook sacrifice, because after king takes queen h5, you do give a check and you hit the bishop. So if you play something like king e7, well, there is queen takes e5, and white gets so much compensation because the black king is wide open. The pieces are still on the queen side. There are a number of checks. You can take the pawn on d4. White's position for just an exchange, it just plays itself. Therefore, instead king f6 was played, and now Magnus played the move f4. Attacking the bishop, and of course the bishop is in trouble. If it goes away, there's this possibility to take the pawn on d4, after which the king comes under an attack one more time. So black is in serious trouble. Of course, maybe there are some better moves than others, but in a practical game with such an exposed king, this is not much fun to play. The best move here for black, which was not played, is bishop takes f4. So you give up the bishop voluntarily, and after pawn takes f4, the king should come back to a safer place. The pawn on d4, it's defended, but after continuing with a move like d3, with the plan of going knight d2, castling queenside, you put a rook on e1, the knight can come into maybe e4 or c4. White's position is absolutely fantastic. So that will, of course, be a full point for Magnus in a normal game. So instead, let's see what happened, because black decided to play here the move c5 to support the pawn on d4 even better. Not that it's going to help that much, but there followed now queen takes e5. It's by far the most logical move. However, maybe taking with the pawn would have been a better idea, because look at this. If you take with the queen, now the king went back to f7, but let's say if the king would have gone to g6. This is far from clear. If you do give another check with the bishop, developing with gain of time, this seems to be so logical. The king can hide on h6. That's just absolutely insane. There are no good checks. The king, it looks like you're almost getting mated, but the queen is covering all the checks on f6 and on g5. But most importantly, if black were to play, he will put the queen on h4 with check. And then the white king is in trouble, as the black queen can start giving checks. This is apparently going to be a draw. However, it feels just so unnatural to put your king on g6. And after king g6, a much better move is queen e4, so that you're guarding your own king side with your queen. The game goes on, and white is still in good shape. But after king f7, black's position collapses pretty fast. Queen h5 check, king e7 played. Now you pick up the pawn with check. King e8 was played, and now queen h5. Another check, king d7, and now the pawn on d4 is taken. So white is an exchange down, but look at this. He has like 2 pawns for the exchange. You're attacking the rook, so the rook went to e8, and now it's time to get other pieces into play. Knight c3, knight c6, so black wants to get rid of that bishop, but the other bishop comes out to b5 to pin the knight on c6, king c7, and now you just take on c6, eliminating a very important defender. If you do take with the king, it's queen b5 check, and after a move like king c7, it's bishop e5, and black is in big trouble here. So that's one of the lines where it's clear that the king really needs to get more support. So black decided to take back with the pawn, but now after castling queenside, it's for the rook time to join play. Ideas like rook g1 followed by rook g7 are pretty obvious. So black senses that, okay, this pawn move b4 is a weakening one. Played here the move a5, but here b5 is played, which is a very good move. So the queen covers the 5th rank. If you do take on b5, the most precise here is queen e5 check. After king b7, queen takes b5 with another check. King c7, bishop b6, and the queen will be lost. One of the many lines in which white is winning material. So rather than taking on b5, they followed bishop d7, but now the knight comes into a4. There's another interesting shot, threatening bishop b6. So if you take the pawn, bishop b6, the queen is lost again. Therefore, the queen had to go away. Queen e7 played. Black is looking for a counterattack against the pawn on a3, but after queen e5 check, black is in more trouble, because queen d6 runs into bishop b6, and black has to give up the protection of the queen. King b7, queen takes d6 is leading to a checkmate in a few moves. So the king instead went to c8. There are many good moves here, but Magnus finishes the game in style with the move b6, not minding. Queen takes a3 with check. Looks as if the black king, the black queen finally hits the white king on c1, but there is bishop to b2. Blocking the check, you're attacking the queen, and here Agibileg had seen enough. He resigned because the queen is going to be lost. If you move the queen, let's say you take the knight, then it's checkmate on c7. That's the main idea of the cooperation between the queen and the pawn. So I thought this was a very funny game, Magnus playing the Orangutan, but you can also say Magnus really played like an orangutan himself. Just totally insane opening play, fun to see, obviously, but it's not something you should really consider doing yourself. So think twice before following the former world champion with his opening choices. And make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that.